Hi CAM followers, welcome to another evening with us on CAM. Firstly, I'd like to apologise for a few technical difficulties tonight. We've got on at 7 rather than 6, so hopefully you'll all be able to join us still. Tonight we are so lucky, we're joined from America by the lovely Dr. Ernie Ward, and we're going to be talking all about obesity and weight management in our doggies. So with no further ado, I'm going to pass over to Ernie, if you don't mind introducing yourself.
Well, thank you, Esme. Thank you guys for spending a little time with us tonight. We're talking about a really important topic, and that is pet obesity, which is a disease state that affects more dogs and cats than any other disease state that we currently deal with. So we're excited to talk to you about some of the tips and tricks and advice you need and why you should actually think about this in a more serious fashion. I am the founder of the Association for Pet Obesity Prevention, which is how a lot of veterinarians know me. I also have a plant-based dog food company out in the San Francisco Bay Area, but that's another topic for another night. So tonight we're going to focus on my experiences, research around pet obesity. I've written several books around this. I guess my most famous one is called Howells, which was published way back in 2010. I've co-authored a bunch of textbooks and peer-reviewed research. So when it comes to obesity, this has been a real passion of mine. And Esme, I think I'd like to also just share a little bit about why has obesity captured my attention, and why have I spent so many years and now decades of my professional career pursuing, these answers around a problem that for a lot of people is kind of silly, right? It's a fat cat, it's a happy cat, Garfield, eat pasta. But the reason that I focused on this early in my career was quality of life, because as a young veterinarian and as a person who, I'm into ultra endurance sports. So I was doing Ironman. I was a personal trainer. I was doing all these things in my human life to keep me at my fittest. But then I was seeing cats go from 10 pounds to 12 pounds to 20 pounds. And I was seeing a decrease in their enjoyment. I was seeing an increase in the number of diseases. And then I was seeing them die a miserable, suffering death. So what led me down this path was really this deep desire to improve the quality and longevity of the pets that I love. And I really felt like, especially when we go back 20 years ago, when I really started the association and started bringing this awareness to our profession, because prior to that, Esme, you weren't in the profession at that time, but this was not discussed. This was just not discussed. And I want to bring this awareness that this was a bigger problem than many veterinarians realized, and that the consequences were more severe. And so that led me, to nutrition, to exercise, to a lot of interesting stories that have helped me, kind of come here today to share with you.
Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things, I think it's a little bit of a scary topic for vets to talk about with owners. We were just talking about this before we went live, but there's a lot of people who are quite offended. So I think it's a really good topic to talk about on here in an open way, where we can explain why it's so important to have a nice slim dog, not just from a looks point of view, and obviously we talk about organ health and things as well, but from CAM we're always really, really worried about arthritis. So I'm really, really excited to get digging into this topic.
Well, and Esme, that's a really good, I'd like to just add on to your point there. What really frustrates me is how contentious and controversial pet nutrition has become. It's almost become religion, at least in the United States. And, I have this running joke that I use at my veterinary lectures, and it goes like this. If you want to start a bar fight, just ask someone what they feed their pet. And emotions are so charged around that simple question that people get really opinionated and firm in their beliefs. My latest book is called The Clean Pet Food Revolution: How Better Pet Food Will Save the World. And I really talk about the environmental damage that meat-based pet foods are causing on our planet. So climate change, animal welfare, deforestation, water contamination. So we kind of go through all of this. And I think if you would check out the book, you'd be surprised at how big of a contributor pet food around the world is, and more importantly, in my country, the United States. But we were recently reviewed in the Times, right? That's the big newspaper. Is that right?
Yeah.
So they did this big front page spread, not the front page, but the front of the book section, lifestyle or whatever it was. And so it was a really, really great review, but we had over 500 comments with some of the most vitriolic language you can imagine. And I was kind of sitting there as my friends were sharing with me these comments from the UK, which I always thought was a very polite country, quite frankly. But, I was going, what would motivate? Like, why would someone be moved to say such outrageous, offensive things just because I wrote a book talking about the harms of factory farming, right? So it's a very interesting topic, and obesity gets baked into that controversy. So I always appreciate the opportunity to share with pet parents like you.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, so I feed my dogs a grub-based protein dog food, UK-based, because I mean, honestly, I just wanted to try it because I've been doing a lot in my life to improve my environmental impact. And I thought, well, I'll use it as a guinea pig for my dogs. And actually, they both had skin issues and it's resolved. Right. And I have tried prescription things because it's a novel protein. And I'm really happy with it. It's got good level of protein in it and it's been great for me. But it is one of those things that I don't talk about a lot. So I wouldn't even really bring it up.
Unless I brought it up, right. And it's one of the, but again, what I want people to be is to be open-minded, right, and not to be ignorant, and not to just accept things as truth, but to actually say, I might not know the truth. I need to educate myself, and so this is why I enjoy writing books and giving lectures and really opportunities like this. So I apologize.
No, it's brilliant. We love it. So should we get stuck in then? So can you explain a little bit to somebody who doesn't know much about obesity, the pathophysiology, so the things that are going wrong in the body that happens when there's a pet that's overweight?
Right. And in simplest terms, there's a clear distinction between obesity, which is a disease state, as you mentioned, a pathophysiology storm that is causing damage to multiple organs, if not all of the entirety of the body, and just being overweight. And the clinical distinction really begins at what type of irreversible damage is occurring. And I think that that's a great starting point for this conversation, because when Esme and I are talking about obesity, already in our mind, we have transcended, oh, your cat's a little portly or a little chunky or chonky or whatever, right? We now see a chronic inflammatory state. So see, I don't see like extra fat. I see the chemicals and compounds that fat tissue is producing. And this is one of the other myths and misperceptions, is people think of fat tissue as being this inert lump, right? It's something that makes it more difficult to put on your jeans or makes it unsightly to slip into a bikini in the summer. And so we don't think of it as being a biologically active tissue, just like your pancreas or your liver or your kidney. And in fact, in the world of endocrinology, we refer to fat tissue as the second pancreas, because second to the pancreas, fat tissue produces the second most amount of compounds and hormones and chemicals. So this is really, really dynamic tissue. So now when I see that kitty cat who has 4 pounds of fat, so it's now, let's say it's a 15, 16 pound cat that should weigh 10 or 11 pounds. Yeah. And I suddenly see an entire organ system that's pumping out continuously harmful chemicals. We call them adipokines, adipocytokines. Some people have shortened it to cytokine. But regardless of what you call it, these are pro-inflammatory chemicals that are causing damage to the brain, to the liver, to the kidney, to the joints, right? So everything that the blood touches, these chemicals are being transferred and then causing the damage. So again, for purposes of tonight, obesity is a disease state that causes a multitude of severe consequences. It causes a multitude of other diseases like diabetes in cats, like high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease. I mean, we can go on and on. Cancer, of course, is the big thing that I'm most concerned about, versus just a few extra pounds, which is still biologically active, but you probably haven't caused irreversible damage. So hopefully that maybe settles a little bit of the score between obesity, disease. Being overweight is just something that we want to avoid getting to the obese state.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, from our point of view as vets, as soon as we see them at the overweight point, So we often categorize the weight by a body condition score. So we look at the shape of the body rather than the specific weight, because that can vary and it's not always that helpful. But as an owner, that's a good guide to know where you should be. But as a vet, often we look at the body condition score. So if we do it out of 9 and your dog is at a 6, we'll say, right, it's time we get on top of this before we get 7, 8, 9. And you really are at that point where your dog is ill because it's fat. So that is, I think that's really important. And I think it is understanding that process that, yeah, your dog might be happy because he's eating more treats, but he's not going to be happy when he's suffering with all of these diseases that we just can't manage because there's so many of them.
Right. And this has been proven and demonstrated clinically. So our dear friend, Dr. Alex German at the University of Liverpool, who is, again, one of my crusaders, advocates against obesity. And I've worked with Alex for, nearly 20 years now. But they did a simple study several years ago to measure whether or not the quality of life in dogs with obesity could be improved by weight loss. And if so, how much weight did they have to lose before the owners said, okay, we see a difference? So they had this validated scale, a quality of life measurement scale, and it was pretty simple questions. It was measuring things like activity levels. Were they able to walk up a few steps or hop into the car? Things like that. And so these owners in the study, they basically were taken and they established poor quality of life at the outset. So when they started, nearly all of the owners on this validated quality of life study said poor quality of life, suffering. Okay. Well, what they did was then they started dropping the weight and asking the same questions over and over again. And here's the great news. When these dogs in the study lost as little as 6% of their body weight, so put it in reference, that's a 100-pound Labrador that lost 6 pounds. So it's not a huge amount, but that is when owners started to notice an improvement in the quality of life. And so this gives us great hope because it tells us that we see demonstrable differences, changes, improvements with little weight loss. Now, of course, the dogs that continued losing and they lost 10 or 12 or 15% even were happier, if you will, have a higher quality of life score. But the reality is you don't have to sit back and go, well, there's no way I can ever get my dog to lose 25 pounds. You may not have to. You may actually see improvements by losing 4 or 5 pounds.
Yeah. So they're going from that obese to just an overweight category even.
That's the goal. Yes.
Yeah. Brilliant. And I think, I'm a Liverpool grad, so it was all pumped into me about obesity management from the start by Alex, which is brilliant. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought there. But I think it is so important to have that understanding that it isn't necessarily a target of we do everything here in dog kilos. So you've got a 30 kilo dog. You don't need to lose 5 kilos necessarily. That 1 kilo may be enough to make that big change to that dog. And particularly in arthritis, we see that so much that actually one of the biggest helpers over drugs, over physio, over everything else is just weight loss. Weight management is so important.
Yeah, it is. And when you look at the human studies, Esme, they are completely in support of that statement right there, that if you look at a person with knee or hip, arthritis, the best thing that person can do is to lose 5 pounds. I mean, it's quite remarkable, even small, amounts, because there's 2 things at play with arthritis. And I apologize for jumping into this, but I think it's important to note. The two ways that obesity impacts the joint of every dog and cat that is carrying a few extra pounds even. Number one, mechanical forces. So the loading forces are compounded. And actually, when you look at the math, it's exponential. So that extra 2 or 3 pounds suddenly generates tremendous more times the force or loading factors on those small joints, right? Because this is a mass versus volume, the surface area. So it's really, really tough on that Chihuahua when they have 2 or 3 extra pounds. The amount of damage to that joint mechanically is significant, tremendous even. So you've got the loading forces, and most people think of that in terms of injury, right? So now you're carrying a few extra pounds, you go out and you play on the weekend, softball or whatever you play, frisbee and soccer in the UK. Yeah. And so, they blow out their knee, right? So these are direct results of that. That's maybe a little more complicated, but they damage, the ligaments in their knee. Yeah. The second way that obesity causes arthritis and exacerbates arthritis and pain is by inflammation. And this is why there's so many studies in humans on arthritis of non-weight-bearing joints in people with obesity. So, I mean, I want this to sink in for a second. So many humans who have obesity wind up having terrific pain in their wrists, in their elbows, in their fingers. And for years, people are like, well, we don't really know why. Maybe they did a lot of repetitive stuff, which could be true. But more importantly, it was the chronic inflammation, the damage, the direct impact that those chemicals we were talking about a second ago, they're being produced by fat. That's what's actually causing the deterioration of the joint, leading to osteoarthritis, which then leads us straight to cats. So there was a confounding study about 20 years ago now, I think it's probably, 15 or 20 years ago now, where they took a large number of cats that had been hospitalized at universities, and someone went and pulled their x-rays. So these cats were at the university for kidney failure, for heart disease, for something other than what they were looking for. And what they were looking for were radiographic changes consistent with osteoarthritis. And in simplest terms, they found that about 80 to 85% of all the cats had demonstrable radiographic changes consistent with arthritis. And Esme, you know this study very well. But remember, for a long time, people were sort of like going, I'm not sure what this means. But later, as we learned more about the inflammatory effects of obesity, it started to connect. And so suddenly people said, oh, we get it now, right? Because when they then went and cross-referenced with weight, many of these cats were 14 or 16 pounds. They had obesity. And so years and years of inflammatory changes within the joint resulted in osteoarthritic changes. So it's a double whammy.
Yeah, and it's such a life-changing thing for that pet, because once the arthritis is there, it's not going anywhere. It's there. So it's so important that we get this right from the start, and we make those changes as early as we can. We've had a couple of questions. Louise said, the big question is how to convince someone that their dog is overweight. How do we do that?
Right. And you do it politely, and you do it in a non-threatening fashion. And, I've written a lot about this, and a lot of my writing, of course, is in veterinary textbooks and things to try to help veterinarians with that exact dilemma, because we're afraid of offending or inadvertently offending a client. And so I think that the best advice I say is, number one, we have to have an open and trusting relationship with any medical provider. And I think that perhaps 30 years ago, when I was a young veterinarian, it might have been easier than it is today. And I think that's primarily also with choice. There's so many more veterinarians today that suddenly, people have lots of choices. And maybe back in the day, they were stuck with this ugly mug, right? But the reality is, you've got to have this relationship where with your human medical and your veterinary medical providers, where you feel comfortable telling them things you're worried about. And conversely, the veterinarian must feel comfortable that we can tell you, the pet parent, that they're concerned about something. And I think that level of trust is sadly lacking these days. It's harder to come by. I don't have a simple solution, but what I can say is this, and I don't know if you're a veterinary professional or not, but my simple rule that I've taught hundreds, if not many vets over my career, is this: whenever I'm telling someone something, no matter what it is, I lead with compassion. And so if I'm dealing with a client whose pet is suffering from obesity, okay, the first thing I'm going to do is start to open the conversation with acknowledging how much they care. So, Esme, it's obvious how much you love your dog Buster. I mean, you can just tell. I mean, you bring him here, you do everything right, but there is something today that I feel we have to talk about, and it is obesity. And that is a disease state. And before we get further, I want you to understand that, I know that word is loaded and emotionally charged and has stigma and bias associated with it. But what I am talking about today is something that's happening internally. And it's not directly your fault or Buster's fault. It is just what we are dealing with today. And I want to help get through this disease. So that's how I'll begin to open that. And sometimes when that door is cracked a little bit in that conversation, the owner just shuts down, because you usually then ask permission. So, what I'm doing is saying, so is this something that, you'd like, to talk about today? And if they don't give me permission, again, you still have to maintain really a positive attitude. I think what happens is when clients give a vet any pushback, oh, this is too expensive, or, oh, you guys are just ripping off, or whatever, we shut down, which honestly, the appropriate response is to do the opposite. It's to open up more. I totally can understand how you feel that way. What can I do to convince you that chemotherapy is the right thing, or acupuncture it would be helpful? So explain to me, what are the things that help me help your pet type of stuff.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is, if they don't give me permission, I say, hey, it's no problem. Hey, I'm here anytime. So if 6 months from now you have a question about Buster's condition, I want you to email me or text me or whatever your preferred method of conversation. And what I have found, Esme, in fact, in Chow Hounds, I write all these stories. And I had a book that came out last year called Better Dog, Better You, Better Life. And we tell all these stories of weight loss success stories. And so, but what I find is that many of them start like this. I go in, I say, I know how much you care. I want to talk to you about this. Can we go further? And they're not ready, right? They feel offended. They feel like I'm judging them as a pet parent, whatever it may be. It's out of my control. But then 6 months later, a year later, I tell the story of 3 years later, they suddenly come to whatever realization, whatever trigger or tipping point, and then they're like ready. Now, Esme, with arthritis and obesity, you know what typically that trigger point is. It's a catastrophe. And so suddenly now the dog is unable to walk. They can't jump up into the car or go up the stairs or whatever, all those quality of life cues. But honestly, and that may be too late, and I feel like I've failed in many of those cases, just being honest and vulnerable with you guys. But the reality is, whatever brings them to that point, I am there to serve them. And I think that's the other part of medical profession that we have to really own, is that we are servants. We are servants of people that come into our facilities, or we go to their homes or whatever it may be. And we have to serve them no matter what the situation is. And sometimes people come to the realization too late. My friend, Dr. Thomas Webb, who I think I mentioned earlier, is a psychologist there in the UK, does a lot of change behavior. And he started out working with the UK government, National Health Institutes, or whatever, I forget how you call that, National Health Service, on smoking cessation. And I remember, Tom, one night we were having dinner, and he was saying, Ernie, the sad thing is most people quit smoking after a diagnosis of cancer. And, while that may be frustrating, it's still our obligation professionally to offer help. Yeah.
And the other point to the question that Louise asked is, how do you deal with it when the owner has clearly got weight issues as well?
Yeah, that's the second. You guys are great. It's like you've come to my lectures. So there are 2 slides I always say, what if the client is overweight or has obesity? And again, this is where we have to be non-judgmental. As veterinary professionals, see, I'm not there to offer the pet parent advice on their own health condition. And so that open, trusting, transparent communication conduit that must be established, that's really where it all is. I do tell stories in my books where, people did not take the news well. And, I got threats from husbands and things like that later. And that's just part of the game. But, it's like one of those things where I try to tell people, this happens in every facet of veterinary medicine. I mean, every vet that's been practicing, at least if you've been practicing as long as I have, you've had a client who got upset with you when you said your dog or cat needs to be spayed or neutered. Well, I want to let my children see the beauty, the miracle of life, stuff like that, right? So, I mean, we all encounter those types of criticisms and objections, and it's just how we then deal with them. So as veterinary medical professionals, we really have to learn how to not let those exterior judgments affect our perception of ourselves. And I know that's easier said than done, but really self-worth is something that you have to develop and you have to maintain. And, so you've heard people like me talk about wellness for 20 plus years. What we're actually saying is you've got to be able to repair and restore, because the world is going to come in and object. I've gotten off on a tangent, but when that client is in that room, I have blinders on to their physical state. And I really, I tend to just say, let's focus on your dog. I don't really ever get into that person. I will tell you what makes it more difficult, in my opinion, is when the veterinarian has obesity, because then they are being judged by the client in many instances. And they're literally this conversation that I've written about many times when we talk to clients, they're like, who is this person to tell me to help that my dog needs to lose weight? Right. Yeah. And so there's this bilateral judging. And, I've been doing a series. In fact, I write for some of the UK journals as well. I'm really, really thrilled to be able to write some of those. But I wrote an article about 3 years ago called Accidental Pet Care Shaming, in which I actually talk about obesity to veterinary professionals and just talking about how, okay, we've got to be very, very careful of our, that people feel that they're being judged by us. We're judging them, they're judging us. It's this really negative circle that we have to be conscious of and then be actively trying to correct. So probably didn't quite answer the question, but there's a lot in there.
There's so much. Yeah. I think, I think you're right. You have to establish that relationship with the client where they trust you and they understand that you're coming from the best point of view and it's not about them. I don't notice what weight. I never think about what weight my client is. I don't worry about that. So I'm not judging them, but I am thinking about their dog and I'm worrying about what might happen or what is already happening. And then I just give my best advice. And my favorite saying is that I'm your pet's voice. So I'm here. I look at all the information I've got. I hear all the things you tell me about their history. I collate all of the stuff that I find on the physical exam, and then I'm telling you in human words what your dog would love to tell you, and that's all I'm trying to say. And I think it is difficult, but I always go back to when people bring up this topic about the owners. We have a choice what we put in our mouths. We get to choose that, and that's up to that owner. And there's many reasons why people can become obese, so we don't want to get into that. But the owner has a choice what they put into their dog's mouth, and we can really help and support them if we do it in a really, really positive way. So I think it's just trying to keep everything super positive, not I think, like you said, not a blame culture, so not making them feel terrible for their dog getting there, but really encouraging. Weight clinics with nurses are brilliant because we do free ones at our practice. Most places do. Regular weigh-ins, celebrating every time, even if it's not a gain. Sometimes you need to celebrate that as well. Just if it stayed the same, but we haven't put weight on, that's sometimes okay. More celebration when they've lost weight, but and always acknowledging that, and then having that point where we say, well, right, we've got there, we're finally there, we're at a point where we're happy, right, let's try and keep it there, let's keep on and just keep that relationship going. So you're seeing that pet regularly and keeping that relationship open and the communication open. And then if things have slipped a bit, the owner's already halfway there. They said, I know I've let it go, right, okay, well, we've already started this, we've already done that. And it works so much better than if you go and you say, oh God, your dog's really fat, you need to get it on a diet now. And they're not going to listen to that. The second you're negative, that's it, gone.
Absolutely. And I would encourage you, if you're a veterinary professional, that was published, I think, in the Veterinary Business Journal, 2 or 3 years ago or so. But I really go into the science behind microaggressions and microexpressions. And really what happens is, just like Esme said, if you sort of go in there and you already have made comments or judgments about the client, well, it's going to come out. Like, you can't conceal it because these are things that are giving us away non-verbally. So again, I think the reason that I've had great success here is because I've come at you have to have an authentic self. Like, you really genuinely have to say, I'm not here to talk about your weight. I'm here to be the voice of your dog, as Esme says. And I think that when people try to conceal that, and they really have just walked into the exam room saying, oh my gosh, no wonder the dog is, 20 kilos overweight, it's just going to completely sabotage their best efforts. So again, I want vets to be authentic, genuine, compassionate, non-threatening. And, these aren't just words. These are goals to aspire to.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think this time as we get stuck into how to manage weight then, so how do we tackle it? What can owners do to tackle their dog's weight?
Right. And so here's where, when we start to talk, there's two different parts of this conversation. So for the veterinarian, I always say, you find the adjacency. And so if you try to confront change head on, it becomes really a challenge. And honestly, it becomes adversarial, because I'm now saying everything you're doing is wrong. That's a judgment. You must change everything that you've been doing. That's a judgment. So what we're trying to do is find those things that are adjacent, that they were doing that were good, and we incentivize, support, nurture, and encourage, right? So a lot of times we can find this even around behaviors of feeding frequency. So maybe they only feed the dog its 2 main meals, morning and evening. That's a great opportunity, because you want to start to celebrate, lean into the 2 feedings. Maybe, however, though, they give 8 treats a day, right? So it's all day long. It's just a all-day buffet of treats. Well, so that's something that we want to try to counter. So what we say is, okay, look, hey, great. So I've got a new text. I wrote a chapter in a new textbook coming out. Lowell Ackerman's the editor on it. One of the veterinary consult series in the US and the UK. And so I wrote an entire chapter on narrative nutritional history taking. And so basically what we're trying to do is to get information from the client to get them to tell us truth. Because if you just say to a client, how much do you feed? What do you feed? You really don't get very valuable or truthful or accurate information. So what you try to do is engage them into telling you the story of that a typical day in the life of Buster or whatever. And so we go through some prompts that you can use to encourage that type of storytelling, because people don't do it naturally, and they certainly don't do it in a veterinary setting. So the first thing I try to do is find where can I slip in and encourage. So the twice a day feedings, that's a start. Great, fantastic. So one of the things I love that you're already doing, we're celebrating, we're leading with compassion, is that twice a day feeding is probably perfect for Buster. And honestly, I don't care if it is or is not. I'm trying to find that one thing I can latch onto and incentivize, nurture, right? And that way, because people like to be told that they're doing something right. So we're going to try to find that little thing, right? And so here's what we're going to do. Instead of like giving the 8 treats throughout the day, what we're going to do is in the morning, we're going to weigh the food, and we're going to give just that food, okay? But what you're going to do is you're going to take aside, a cup or whatever bowl or whatever of that treat, and we're going to use that as the treat up until lunchtime. Now, at lunchtime, everybody deserves a goodie, so you're going to go back and give your regular treat. So what I've really done in many of those cases is probably knock down 2 or 3 or 4 or more treats just by saying, let's wait until lunch to give the big gooey, ooey, yummy, right? And so we replace that with regular, complete and balanced food. And we may repeat that in the afternoon. It just depends on the scenario. But what I'm trying to do is say, A, let's focus on the feeding behavior, weighing the food. B, let's try to withdraw or remove or diminish as many of the treats as possible by still giving a high reward value. So let's just delay gratification until lunchtime. It's really not a big ask. People are feeding at 7, 8 a.m. You give a few kibbles of treat if you feel you need to, and you wait until lunchtime to give them a first goodie, right? And as we work our way down the process, what you find is it's easier and easier to subtract things away. So now you can weigh a little, give a little less of the complete and balanced feed. You can cut the dog bone or whatever in half, right? So those are the kind of subtractions that we try to make. But if you go into a client and say, all right, here's what you got to do. Got to cut out these treats. 8 treats a day, too much, right? Already now we're in a confrontational stance. These people are not going to be willing to listen to anything else I hear because they feel judged already. So what I do is I come in, find that adjacency, that one in, celebrate that, start to subtract other things. Hey, it's great. These treats are fine. They may not be my favorite personally, but I'm the pet obesity guy. But here's what I say. Let's just knock out, the 2 that you give in the morning. Let's replace it with some of the kibble. Your dog will still love you for it. And then we focus on giving him that big reward at lunchtime. And then maybe when you come home from work, you give him another one of those yummy gummy treats or whatever it may be. But that's a simple step. But honestly, when it comes to weight loss, you really have to, it gets a lot more complicated quickly, because you have to identify what I call the pet owner's feeding philosophy. And this is where I think most vets actually completely go off the rails, quite frankly, because let's say you've got an owner who is really concerned about quality of food. She wants only organic. They're vegan, right? They're like me. They're worried about something, and the vet comes in and he says, well, here's a therapeutic diet. And they look on the label and it's all corn and has, non-GMO. Right. Yeah. So you now have a misalignment with the pet owner's feeding philosophy, in which case they're not going to adhere to your recommendation. Conversely, you have a pet owner who buys the cheapest pet food they can find, right? Whatever's on sale at the big bulk retailer, that's what they feed their cats. Well, you suddenly trot out this special diet food that costs 5 times what they're used to paying. Again, you've got a food philosophy misalignment. They're not going to adhere to that. And this is what frustrates me too, Esme. You've seen this so many times, I'm sure, where people buy one bag of the therapeutic diet and that's it. And you see them 6 months later and it's like, what happened? Well, you never got that alignment. So part of this narrative nutritional history that I write about and lecture about really drives at getting that. So I want to put the people in the correct food slot. And this is, again, why veterinarians have to be open-minded about feeding choices, because too often veterinarians only offer one or two brands. And that's just not how the world operates. I mean, pet owners can go to a Petco in the US or a PetSmart, these large pets for pets at home. Yeah, pets at home.
Yeah, well done.
And they've got hundreds of choices. And so when they're vet, they're like, this isn't right. They feel like they're being sold to and all this stuff. So we really do have to expand our knowledge base on other foods, because people just aren't going to accept, well, here's your one choice. They want lots of choices.
Yeah. I mean, this may be just my personal approach, but I probably do very similar to what you talked about, in that I find out what they feed first, and then I try and get the information from their food company on the calorie amount in that food. And then I calculate what their calorie allowance should be. And then we do that for a month. And if the weight loss hasn't come off, and I've already prepped the owner to say, right, well, we're going to try something else if this doesn't work, then we move on to a prescription diet, which I know is going to have better effects. There's a lady called Beth has asked, I'll pop the question up. She said, do diet dog foods work, or is it better to carry on feeding your dog their usual food and reduce the quantity?
Right. And so Esme and I were both kind of hinting at this. So in general terms, they don't work. And they don't work because it's a mismatch between the nutrient density and the caloric density. And that sounded like a bunch of medical jargon, and it was. And let me explain. So let's say you have a complete and balanced dog food. And I have a dog food company, so I know how the regulations and rules are. So basically, there are very strict guidelines on how we put feeding guides, how much vitamin C is in the food, how much, well, not vitamin C, for example, but how much vitamins and minerals and fats and carbs and all this stuff. So if we suddenly just say, I'm going to reduce just arbitrarily by half. Well, what we've done is we reduced half of the essential nutrients. So this is the nutrient density and the caloric density mismatch beginning. So now by feeding half the calories, they're getting half of the omega-3 fatty acids. They're getting half of the vitamin E that they require. They're getting half of the selenium, right? Half of the amino acids. So what we do is we make these prescription therapeutic weight loss diets that actually have fewer calories while maintaining the high level of nutrients, so that when we feed lower calories, we're not feeding fewer nutrients. And that's hopefully that makes a little more sense to you, because what I see many pet owners make this a dangerous mistake in some cases, where they just feed their cat half as much food. And again, what they've done, they've fed half the nutrients that it needs. And for cats, things like arachidonic acid and other essential fatty acids, this can be devastating. So this is, you've probably heard about fatty liver failure, hepatic lipidosis. So these cats that are suddenly cut, drastically, or they refuse to eat, in 72 hours, they can go into liver failure and die. So like the stakes are pretty high. So we tell people, I like Esme's approach. We'll reduce by 10, maybe 15% a complete and balanced food. But when you start dropping it much below 20, 25%, you really do run the risk of nutrient deficits. So it's a great question.
Yeah, and I think it just depends how much you're feeding your dog in the first place. Because if you're ignoring the guidelines and you're feeding them way more, then feeding within the guidelines might be perfect. That might be enough to get your dog to the ideal scenario. But we've all got just the same as humans. Some people can eat loads and they don't put any weight on, and others we eat loads and we put loads of weight on. And it's the same in dogs. And I think you have to find the right food that matches your dog's metabolism. And I don't know if it's the same in the US, I'm sure it is, but there's two types of veterinary prescription diet that you can use. One is like a low fat diet, which is lower in calories, and then there's one that's similar, but it actually speeds up the metabolism a bit, so it makes your pet's body work a little bit. This is a bit basic how I'm describing it, but it makes the metabolism work a bit faster. Right. And we do actually also have one that fills them up. Satiety food can fill them up, so low calorie, but makes them feel like they're fuller. So that's quite good for those Labradors who feel like they need to eat constantly. So I don't know what your experience is with those different types of food, or if you have a preference, Ernie.
Yeah, it is. And when you look at the evidence, I mean, it's pretty clear for humans and dogs. And I'll just start by giving you the broad equation. So for weight loss for humans and dogs, and there's a reason that they are man's best friend. And I've written exhaustively about the unique adaptations genetically and, of course, from a nutritional standpoint that make them man's best friend. We've co-evolved for 45,000 years. So we've kind of co-evolved to adapt to the same foodstuffs. But regardless, human and dog weight loss, the equation is about 60 to 70% diet, food, and only 30 to 40% exercise activity. So obviously tipping the scales clearly into the food bowl. But for cats, it's even more dramatic. For cats, again, very different physiological system, very different energy needs and requirements and sources. Cats, weight loss, 90% food and only 10% physical activity. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this, and I don't know that we have time to get into it tonight. It might be a follow-up conversation if people are interested. But if you look at the basic tenets there, obviously the food bowl is where we start. This is where caloric restriction. But this is also where the evidence leads us to high protein diets as being preferred for weight loss in dogs, cats, and humans. So when you look at the evidence, it clearly trends towards high protein, high fiber in combination when ideal, and of course, low calorie. Low fat is and then you can kind of adjust. Carbs, I would cut before fats, but there's reasons for that are nuanced to this discussion. But so high fiber, high protein, low calorie, that's where we start. But like Esme said, I've seen so many dogs over the years that you put them on these diets. And let me tell you right now, if you're a pet owner or a veterinarian, please do not continue on any dietary choice, formulation, solution for more than 90 days without evaluating. And if you aren't seeing the results you want within 90 days, please switch your approach. And I would say switch as dramatically as possible. So then you wind up having these dogs that don't respond to high protein, high fiber, but they respond to high fiber, low protein. So you wind up really finding that perfect mix for your dog. And I will tell, or cat, obviously. Cats actually are a little easier because they respond much better to the higher protein diets. But regardless, you wind up manipulating. And so in general terms, what we do is we reduce the amount of calories to this one mark. And so we typically, feed 80% of what we call the resting energy requirements. That's a big fancy term for like, what's the minimum that an indoor sedentary dog needs, right? So your dog that's spayed or neutered, he's 5 or 6 years of age, doesn't do a lot. He goes for walks in the park with you, does the basic dog stuff, but he's not like running, doing agility trials and feeding trials or hunting trials or whatever. So those dogs, we cut down to about 80% RER, 90 days. If we don't see the results, we drop it to 70% RER, never below that, even for therapeutic diets. And if that doesn't work, we change the approach completely. I start looking for disease also.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Somebody mentioned that before, because there are, do you mind going into that a tiny bit? What sort of diseases can we see that might cause weight gain or lack of weight loss?
Yeah, right. And those are two really good independent questions there. So when you look at the things that would stall, we look at hormones. The things that would increase weight, we look at hormones. So obviously the classic is thyroid. Many people are familiar with this. Low thyroid disease or hypothyroidism, particularly when you look at dogs like beagles and other breeds, bassets, you wind up seeing those dogs, of course, gain weight. But then hyperthyroid or overactive thyroid, we think of that in terms of the skinny cat. So the thyroid regulates the metabolic rate in simplest terms. And so if it's too low, you gain, you tend to store more excess energy in form of fat. And of course, if it's too high, you tend to burn more excess energy from fat. So that's oversimplified. The other thing we look at are things like cortisol, so the stress hormone. And there's a lot of emerging research to link stress, anxiety, things like separation anxiety with dogs that are, again, stress hormone leads to overeating, leads to accumulation or to more efficient storage of fat. And so you wind up having dogs that have behavioral problems, and cats too. And I write about this exhaustively. This is a little more speculative, so I'm kind of getting off the evidence path here slightly. But we do believe that behavior and stress leads to overeating behaviors, again, leading to that. We also look at diseases. There are many, many forms of you look at pituitary disruptions. Those are a little more rare and unusual. So adrenocortical diseases can cause things like this. We do see some forms of heart disease that can cause, fluid accumulation. I don't really like to talk about that because I think that's very, very rare. But when I look at hormones, I always look at hormones, but don't forget medications. Some anti-seizure medications can cause excess weight gain. There's emerging evidence that disruptions in the microbiome, so the gut bacteria due to excessive antibiotic use, can also lead to weight gain in dogs. Less evidence in cats at this time, more evidence in humans for sure. So those are the kind of diseases that I look at. I look at their medication profiles, particularly around seizure medications, and then I look at, have they been on antibiotic courses recently? And we always screen for thyroid.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. So we've touched a little bit on food. One thing I'll just mention is in CAM, we often recommend that people feed lots of meals through the day, but we weigh out our food in the morning just because of if you've got a very arthritic dog who can't do very much, that's a little bit of pleasure for them through the day. So we might do activity games for them, hide things in shoe boxes, all that sort of stuff. So it's a very interactive way to feed them. But again, that doesn't mean you feed them more. It just means you feed them that one type of food more frequently. But what other ways can we manage obesity in pets?
Well, I certainly like the enrichment. So food puzzles, as she's describing, those are great. I'd say the evidence is probably not as strong as it leaning towards weight loss. And honestly, there's actually some really interesting research that shows satiety increases with larger meals, particularly in dogs. So cats are much more amenable to these frequent feeding strategies, but dogs, the way they evolved, actually didn't evolve to eat multiple frequent feedings. And there's some considerable debate on the metabolic ramping up that's out there. But I do like things that enrich the environment, because what Esme is really driving at there is that stress, boredom, anxiety, these are the types of things that can drive cortisol hormone up, which then can lead to overeating and actually cravings in dogs. And so if anybody's ever been stressed out and had a sudden urge to go eat, chocolates or something, ice creams and things like that, that's the reality. So that's cortisol talking. That's the stress talking. So I do worry about more of those things. So environmental enrichment is great for sure. I tend to do less of the multiple feedings and more of the treatings, because what I've observed, Esme, in our studies is that people have a strong motivation to give their dog primarily treats, and they want to treat them excessively. And so I try to lean into that adjacency, as we were discussing earlier, as opposed to saying, they're already feeding twice a day, I'm going to get more precise with my feedings, but then I change the treating behavior, so I think it's a subtlety, a nuance, but I do think it bears repeating. But I do also like, there's some amazing sort of automated toys that are coming out that, the dog can interact with. I think at the end of the day, we want to get our dogs enriched mentally, behaviorally. That's really, my own personal opinion is that millions and millions and millions of dogs in our country just aren't receiving adequate environmental stimulation. We've literally taken a dog that is an opportunistic scavenger that evolved with humans, covering large expanse of territory and land every day, going out and looking and engaging in nature, and we've confined them indoors. And Esme, I think that one of the consequences is obesity.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think when you take them out on a sniff, especially when you've got an arthritic dog, we call it a sniffari, because you end up going out and they just want to smell everything. And that's just that natural nature. They want to take in everything, and their sense of smell is so important to them. And then when they're just stuck in the same place all the time, and that's particularly a problem for our arthritic dogs, because they often can't go out. Have you got any tips for exercise side of things when you're considering it in the case of an arthritic dog? Because it is tricky.
Right. It's really tricky. And this is where we want to reduce the amount of mechanical loading forces. So this is underwater treadmills, even terrestrial treadmills we've had great success with, Esme, just they're doggy treadmills, but you can put them on a decline, for example, which can really take some of the pressure off the hips if they're painful, or knees. So there's some creative ways that we can get there. I still think, if they can't do hydrotherapy, if they can't get to an underwater treadmill, just slow, gradual walks on soft surfaces. It's hard to beat that, to go to a grassy knoll, to a park, and really just walk with your dog at the pace that it wants to do. With arthritis, if your dog doesn't have arthritis, I've published all these different charts for paces. We did a study probably around 07, 08, where we went to neighborhoods and we tracked through video. So we just timed the people, how fast they were walking, right? So we had a mark. It was a simple study. And we found that the average dog walker was a 22-minute per mile pace. And I apologize for not knowing all the equivalencies, but a mile is 1,500 meters. So, 22 minutes.
2 miles as well.
So this is a pedestrian pace at best, and that's really not going to be aerobic, and that's not going to give us the health benefits that humans or our dogs need. In fact, when you look at some of the studies that have been done on human depression, really that most of that aerobic activity comes around 18 to 20 minute per mile pace. You can still have a easy, casual conversation. You're not winded, maybe not even perspiring unless it's hot like it is there today. But we're getting to this to a pace that the body now is settling into. And so I think it's also important that if your dog doesn't have arthritic challenges, that you need to train them to walk so that you can have part of the sniff safari, as we call it here. That can be the first or second half of the walk, but the other half is actually, let's go get some exercise. So it's important to train your dog to actually expect. And what happens is when you actually engage in this habitually, so now the behavior is, okay, at the end of our 10 minutes of sort of just walking straight ahead with our harness on, then we get to go and do the sniff safari. Then you find that the dog actually looks forward to the sniffing aspect. It's a reward. But I tell you, most people, it's dogs and humans are incredibly trainable and adaptable, but you really have to provide the construct for that training to happen.
Yeah, to be a team together as well, isn't it? Making sure you're both on the same page and knowing what you're going to do. So what would your tips be for somebody? Let's say let's say Buster, my imaginary Labrador, who tends to be on the chunkier side, isn't yet obese, but I don't know what to do about getting a food for him. And I'm not specifically, I'm not specifically raw food or vegan or whatever it may be. If I'm just going to the pet shop and I want to choose a food, how would I go about choosing one that's going to be good to keep his weight down?
Well, the great news just at the outset, if you live in the US or the UK or most of the EU, despite what you might have heard in the media, EU has pretty good pet food regulations. The foods that you buy commercially available are going to meet all the nutritional needs of your dog or your cat. They're just not going to be sold in our countries without meeting those safety requirements. So, right now that opens up a lot of possibilities. We then get into personal opinion. I like this protein source. I like these amino acid profiles. I like this, plant-based, right? Whatever it may be, that's where the nuance begins. So if you're going to your local Pets at Home, the store shelves are stocked with healthy, safe foods. We can argue about the nuances, and I certainly have my own, problems with animal meats, but let's just face it, they're safer than anywhere else in the world. So let's go beyond that barrier, and then you say, okay, what do you prefer? This is where we start to get into those feeding philosophies. So do you feed your kids more organic vegetables, right? So that's going to lead you down one pathway. Are you just cost conscious, right? You just need the best bargain for your buck. That's going to lead you down another aisle in the pet food store. So I don't judge people for those choices, but I want them to give some thought to why they're making those choices. I just don't like to haphazardly change things around if I don't have to. And I also want people to say, okay, what's actually I'm pouring into the bowl? How is that impacting the environment around them? But I'm straying into the personal stuff. What's the most important thing you can do, though, is to measure the food precisely. And the only way to precisely do this is actually weigh it. Now, in the UK, you are light years ahead of the US as far as actually measuring foods. But a simple kitchen, gram measurement, it takes us at our home personally, and I have border terriers, so go UK. But it takes no additional time to actually measure, to weigh the food. But if I could do, I think Alex and I, Dr. German and I would both agree, if we could do one thing to transform this particular topic, it would be that every pet owner weighs their food. I think that would solve this for so many of us. I mean, I think that this would lower, it from being 60% of all US cats, 56% of all US dogs, it would probably drop that in half if people would just weigh the food. So of all the things you do, weigh the food.
Absolutely. I think that's it. Know your pet's weight for one, and then weighing things out. I know that so I am quite lazy, so I don't physically weigh it, but what I do is when I buy the bag of food, I have a scoop. I weigh what a scoop is, and then that is what I use, and I only use that size scoop. No one can get it wrong because it's a level scoop for me, so it's easy. It's just done. And I have a sausage dog, so I have to be really careful because if he gets fat, that's his back gone. So I'm really hot on it, and he is greedy. He'll eat anything that's not, if it's not nailed to the floor, he'll have a go at eating it. So I do have to be really, really strict with them. And so I've just found that. So that's another sort of a sneaky way of doing it. But as long as you've weighed it and you know what you're giving, you can't really go wrong. And if your dog's putting weight on the amount you're giving, you can then cut back by 10% and see if that makes a difference. And I think it's just having a really good relationship with your vet, isn't it? Being able to go back and forth, borrow those scales, weigh your dog, chat to them, chat to the nurses are brilliant for this. This is the nurses' thing. They are amazing at sorting out weight problems.
They are. And Esme, again, so one of the things that drives me crazy is, so what's the biggest barrier for us as veterinary professionals? People don't know what their dog weighs or their cat, and they don't know what it should weigh. So you can't even begin to make these caloric calculations. All right. So now one of the things that I'm going to encourage pet owners to do is to learn how to weigh your pet at home. Now, many veterinarians say, oh my gosh, this is ridiculous. This is horrible advice because my scales are calibrated and they're made specifically for dogs and cats. I'm not actually worried about the absolute number. I'm worried about the trend. Because now if you can take your little sausage dog and every 2 to 4 weeks, pick him up, weigh yourself, and then pick up your sausage dog and weigh the difference. And if it's going up, then we're going to cut back the food. But what happens is, and everybody that's watching this, whenever they watch this, is going to relate. If you have a pet, you're going to be like, I had no idea that he gained that much weight. You know, because we weigh them like once a year, every 6 months we go to the vet. So I'm really trying to remove the barriers around this misbelief that you can't weigh your dog at home. Granted, there are some very large dogs with some very small people attached to them, and that's not going to happen. I get it. But for most of the dogs in the UK and the US, my Border Terriers, your Dachshund, we can figure out a way to weigh them once a month on our home scales or something like that. And I think it puts us in the ballpark to change, because if we wait until the vet weighs them, and that's every 6 or 12 months, it's too late. It's just too late.
Yeah, we've got a free service that we do with Cam, and we can put the link in the comments, but we offer free body condition scoring. So it's foolproof. You can just send us pictures of your dog and we will tell you where they are between like 1 and 9 and where they need to lose weight, and we'll support you with that. So we are here as a free service. You're welcome to use us, and we're all volunteers. We all know what we're doing. We're all trained in it. So feel free to shove it over to us, even if you can't get to your vet right now, because I know Corona is probably causing a lot of issues with getting in and weighing and things. And a lot of pet shops as well do have scales. So those larger breed dogs, I know Pets at Home, a lot of them have scales at the front of the shops or upstairs or wherever it may be. So I'm sure you can give it a go.
Somehow we just have to get people in this habit of doing it. You know, I am a strong believer in Wi-Fi connected scales for human health. And so, you know, with things, of course, I don't get paid for this, but I've used them since the very beginning, the early days. But anything I can do to stay aware of me and my family's, you know, our current weight status. And it's not that we obsess over it, but this is just how you track your health. I mean, it's why, you know, I track my sleep, you know, I track my activity. I mean, there are lots of things I do that data, if it's acted upon, can be incredibly beneficial to your health and well-being.
Yeah, that objective, we talk about this all the time on Cam, but we call it objective monitoring of your pet. And it's so important that we not just talking about pain management and how they're mobile, but what they're weighing. That is so important. We can't stress it more. I mean, it's more difficult when you've already got the very slim dog, but if you've got an overweight dog and it's got arthritis, I guarantee you're going to see improvement if you get it down to the ideal weight. You will. Absolutely.
One thing, just want to jump in real quick before we have to end our conversation tonight. There are a couple of things too that I think that I haven't really stressed enough tonight, and I just want to make sure that we get this across. Number one, there are millions and millions of dogs and cats and people who have obesity because of genetics, because of microbiome alterations, because of exposure to environmental pollutants like microplastics. So there's a lot of things that are out of our control that cause, contribute, or exacerbate obesity. And so when I keep talking about being non-judgmental and non-threatening, I mean this because there are a lot of dogs that genetically are predisposed for a high, what we call food drive, and they're going to be more likely to overeat, and they're going to be more likely to pester you for extra treats and beg from the table and so forth. So when we're looking at obesity from a holistic standpoint, we have to also say there may be things far beyond the food bowl that are contributing, that your role as a pet parent isn't influencing. And so we have to also pay attention to all those other things, because I think that too often veterinarians place exclusive sole blame on the pet parent. And many times it is earned and justified. I understand that. But if our thinking is that narrow and myopic, then what happens is it doesn't allow us to be, once again, more open-minded to say, what about the role of environmental pollutants, which I'll tell you, there's emerging evidence for humans. You've probably heard of BPA, bisphenol A. Well, remember, these are hormone disruptors, and in very, very tiny amounts, parts per billion, they disrupt our hormonal systems, leading to obesity. So there's a lot of research that's emerging. And again, our dogs are drinking the same water. They're having packaged foods. I mean, there's a lot of things that I just want us as a veterinary profession, Esme, to make sure that we are really being open-minded about this and not judgmental, and really working with people. The solution right now in the US and the UK, because we don't have medical therapeutics like we do for human obesity, we don't have bariatric surgery solutions. So we are going to advise you to reduce calories. We may recommend certain supplements like L-carnitine, for example, but the reality is we're going to really focus on the food bowl, not because that's the only solution, but because it's the only solution that we currently have available in veterinary medicine.
Yeah, and it's so important, and it is empowering though. I know, because my dog has fluctuated. He's like just over 5 kilos, and him being 5.3 kilos is really fat for him. And it sounds like not a lot, but it is. And I know I'm a vet, so I'm picky, but that 300 grams on my dog makes him a chunk. A proper chunk.
Esme, I'm older than you, so I can say this, but if you have an 8-kilogram Dachshund, that's a back blow, right? I mean, it's like once they get above 8 kilograms, their risk factors are astronomical. Again, just from the loading, mechanical forces, the disproportionate load. So this is why, I mean, you look at a couple of kilograms means a happy, healthy dog versus a disaster. Yeah,
absolutely. Ernie, I am so grateful to you. This has been amazing, and I hope it's been helpful to everybody who's listening. You are so passionate, and it just is exciting, and it makes me really, really want to go and tackle obesity head on. But hopefully it's been inspiring to owners as well to really take control of their pet's weight and be able to do something about that. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And definitely, if you want more information, petobesityprevention.org. I'm sure you can find that. Esme will probably put it in the show notes or whatever, but petobesityprevention.org or drernieward.com, DRERNIE, Ward.com. And you can find out more about my books and videos and blah, blah, blah. So again, it's been a real pleasure talking to you guys tonight. And everyone in this unprecedented time, I mean, take stock, take care, but most importantly, be grateful for the opportunity to continue to communicate to one another on a human level like this, but also to have a pet by your side, because there's been nothing that's gotten me and my family through this more maybe than our dogs and cats. So I feel really, really grateful to have those bits of beings by me, because no matter what's going on in the world around them, all they want is to give me love, and that's really, really amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so true. They're just the best things in the world, aren't they? You can't beat having a dog.
They are. And
thank you, everybody.
Border terriers are, of course, the best.
Yeah.
I'm a little biased.
Arguable. Thank you so much, everybody. Good night.